Director Peters, the Inspector General noted in his statement for today's hearing that solving the Bureau's staffing shortage is, quote, one of the building blocks to begin to address the chronic challenges facing the BOP. He also said that significant staffing shortages have had a, quote, cascading effect on your Bureau's facilities. When you testified 6 months ago, I asked you how many correctional officer positions were filled. You didn't have an answer at the time. Last month, you did an interview with 60 Minutes. You also didn't have an answer. Do you have an answer today for how many correctional officers you currently have on payroll?
Yes, Senator. We have almost 40,000 authorized positions across the organization, and 14,899 of those are correctional officers. We are going to 100% fund those positions. They are only 82% filled at this time.
14,899 are correctional officers.
Yes, correctional officers, the individuals that you would think in your mind are on the units safeguarding our adults in custody.
And you said 40,000. That's your total personnel, right?
That's our total
What are you
personnel.
authorized and funded for by Congress for correctional officers?
For correctional officers, we are authorized at that 14,899 number, and it's 100% funded.
Are you sure you're not authorized around about 20,000?
20,000 is the correctional officer series position. That's 20,466. That includes correctional officers, lieutenant, correctional services officers, which are in our receiving and discharging unit, and also that number includes correctional counselors.
Okay. 14,899 is what you have today. Do you know what you had 6 months ago?
No, Senator, I don't have that number.
Do you know how many new officers have been hired over the last 6 months, new correctional officers?
I know that we've made progress in the last year. We have moved all recruitment and retention from 87% last year to 90%. We moved our correctional officer fill from the 70s into about 82% now.
Okay. In 2022, the Congress passed a law requiring that your employees spend 90% of their time on their primary responsibility. So a correctional officer spends 90% of his time being a correctional officer. An HVAC technician spends 90% of his time doing HVAC work. The Bureau hasn't complied with that law, to my knowledge. 6 months ago when you were here, I asked how much time your employees are spending on average on their primary responsibility. You didn't have an answer. Do you have an answer for that today?
I do, Senator, and it's different in every institution. In some of our institutions, we'll take USP Thompson right now because we've been able to lower the number of, lower the mission. We needed fewer employees, and so we're not relying on augmentation and overtime. When you look at Brooklyn, we are relying on it substantially because of the lack of staffing. Many of my officers are working 16 hours regularly, and we're having to engage in augmentation on a daily basis at that institution, which, as you well know, while those psychologists or teachers, whomever is being augmented, is fully trained and prepared to do that work, it also means that they're not able to do their current job, as you're alluding to.
Yeah. So I take your point that you could average across all of your facilities, but that average is not particularly meaningful because each facility is its own world, and a facility that is well balanced is going to have everyone doing 90% of their job, whether it's HVAC or teacher or counselor or correctional officer. Another facility might be unbalanced and rely heavily on augmentation and overtime. Is that right?
That's correct,
Okay.
Senator. And in those facilities where we are fully staffed or more full staff, we've just given clear direction to those wardens to begin over-hiring so that if they're in an economy where we're actually able to bring in correctional officers, we'll hire them and then we'll TDY them to some of these other institutions that are in more dire straits.
Okay. But based on your answer, I assume you know the answer on a facility-by-facility basis. You have that data available to you?
That's correct, Senator.
Is that data public in any of your published reports?
I will have to check on that and see.
If it's not, if it is, please send us the link. If it's not, could we get that data for
We will work with
the
your
committee?
staff to
Thank
see what
you.
we can share. Yes, Senator.
I want to talk briefly about challenges staffing up. Your correctional officers start out at the GS5 salary level, making $48,000 a year. My understanding is they can top out at $74,000 a year. By contrast, Border Patrol officers can start as high as $68,000, and they can top out at $113,000, even without becoming a supervisor. Does the Bureau have trouble competing with the pay of other federal law enforcement agencies?
It's great trouble competing with other law enforcement agencies. I'll pick on Brooklyn again. As we look at state corrections in New York, individuals can make 2 or 3 times more working for the New York City Corrections Department than the Federal Bureau of Prisons. So even after we issued a 35% retention bonus at Brooklyn, that allows someone after a few years to be making $90,000 a year. For state corrections in the same time period to be making about $130,000 a year.
In the last major appropriations bill that Congress passed in December 2022, Congress asked the Bureau to consider increasing pay to match those other agencies and asked for a review to be submitted no later than last June. Has that review been submitted yet?
Senator, I don't know. I can check. I will tell you that this year I was able to increase the base salary of correctional officers by $2,000. I didn't have the authority to go beyond that.
Okay. Please do and get back to us. One final point, since you and Mr. Horowitz both raised it about contraband in prisons. I think like maybe the most dangerous kind of contraband in prisons is cell phones. Cell phones aren't going to kill anyone themselves, but they enable the commission of many other heinous crimes in prison. That's one reason why I've introduced the Cell Phone Jamming Reform Act, which would make it clear to state prisons that they can use targeted jamming to block cell phone signals in prison housing units. We've had some resistance from the telecom industry. I wish they would come to their senses on this issue. But Ms. Peters, have you conducted pilot programs in your facilities on microjamming and managed access systems?
We have, Senator, at a variety of our institutions, both in terms of detection and jamming. Both prove very successful. What my employees are telling me is the detection versus the jamming is the most helpful, because then we can investigate, figure out who actually has it, who brought it in, and solve the greater flow of the contraband problem.
Okay, and Mr. Horowitz, since you addressed the issue, would you like to make any comment on cell phones in prisons based on your work?
Senator, couldn't agree more. I often say a cell phone in a prison is a deadly weapon. We investigated a murder for hire carried out on a federal correctional officer in Guaynabo, Puerto Rico, where the hit was put on by someone in the prison. And one of the things I've asked for, and I'd be happy to work with you, Senator, on this, smuggling a cell phone into a prison is a federal misdemeanor. It's not a felony. And that, I was surprised by that, frankly. Having been an AUSA for many years, I assumed, of course, it had to be a felony. It isn't. And what we found, by the way, I'm going to tie contraband to sexual assault. As you know, we have a major problem with sexual assaults in prison, not just on female inmates, obviously on female inmates, but also on male inmates. And one of the things we found is that contraband is used to groom inmates. It's the way to gain favor by a correctional officer or a BOP employee. It's not just correctional officer, BOP employee, to gain favor. We prosecuted a chaplain in a federal facility in New Hampshire for bringing in contraband cell phones and other items. So that is something, we shouldn't have to make the bribery case, which is what we have to do to bring the felony charge, as you know as a former prosecutor. That's what we strive to do. But finding the person with the contraband, it's a lot easier to make those cases. We get a lot more prosecuted and get a lot of the very small fraction of BOP staff who are engaged in misconduct out. Because the other thing I know, I met with President White the other day. I know this from my time as a prosecutor in New York, where I prosecuted some corrupt police officers. There is not a single BOP employee who wants to work next to a corrupt employee or a dangerous inmate, right, who's engaging in crimes. So we all have to focus on that.
All right. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. I think there's some valuable suggestions for legislation, and I'm happy to work on a bipartisan basis to see if we can move some of those forward.